Good morning, viewer. Welcome to Fossac TV. Here is a breaking news from China. Yes, when Antony Blinken makes an expected trip to Beijing in the coming days in what would be the first visit to China by US Secretary of State since 2018, he will be cutting a stark contrast to the scenes in the Chinese capital 1 year earlier. Then Chinese leader Xi Jinping welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin for the opening of the Beijing Olympics meetings for talks and dinner in Putin's honor and declaring a no-limits partnership between the two neighbors. Weeks later, as Russian tanks rolled across the border into Ukraine, starting an invasion that would devastate the country and cause a humanitarian crisis, Chinese leaders did not shrink from that declaration. Though Beijing claimed impartiality in the conflict and no advanced knowledge of Russia's intent, it was refused to condemn Moscow. Instead, it parroted Kremlin lines blaming NATO for provoking the conflict, further fracturing relationships with both Europe and the US. A year on, the contrast of a Blinken visit would be no coincidence. Economically drained by its now abandoned zero-COVID strategy, Beijing has been shifting its tone on foreign affairs and upping its diplomacy with Western governments, analysts say, in a bid to win back lost ground and stabilize its relation. In meetings with Blinken during his expected early February trip, as well as European leaders who have signaled they may visit in the coming month, Chinese counterparts are likely to emphasize their long-standing calls for a peaceful resolution and play up what they claim is China's objective and impartial position on the conflict, analysts say. But while the optics may be different from the time last year's, China's support for Russia, when measured by its annual trade, diplomatic engagements and schedule of joint military exercise, tells a different story. Those metrics show that over the past year, China has continued to bolster, not retreat from its no-limits partnership, a relationship that has been strengthening in recent years and which analysts say Beijing continues to view as key to its fundamental goals of maintaining national security and pushing back at a US-led world order. China is very skilled in calibrating the narrative depending on the audience, said Alexander Govrev, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But when it comes to China's ties with Russia in the wake of Ukraine war, I don't see any buyer's remorse. Rather, he added, China is helping itself to the opportunities that this crisis provides. Since the early days of the war in Ukraine, US President Joe Biden's administration has warned the Chinese government of potential consequences for any material support for Putin's invasion. US intelligence officials have consistently said that they have not seen evidence China provided lethal aid to Russia, but the US recently raised concern with China about evidence suggesting state-owned Chinese companies had sold Russia non-lethal equipment, it vehemently denied. While a handful of Chinese companies have been placed on US blacklist in connection with the conflict, most have appeared to calibrate their business to steer clear of violating the extensive sanctions unleashed by the US and its allies against Moscow. Beijing has long stressed that it seeks to play a constructive role towards peaceful resolution of the conflict, and during a September meeting, Putin conceded Beijing had raised questions and concern about the crisis. Yet, China has continued to expand trade with its northern neighbor, opening for the first time two permanent bridges to facilitate trade over a key border river and dumping of a record 1.28 trillion yuan, equivalent to 190 billion last year, according to Chinese data released last month. That marked an increase of around 30% from 2021, driven in part by Chinese companies snapping up discounted oil and coal, even as other governments move to shun Russian fuel, shouldering mounting energy prices to avoid financing Russia. Xi congratulated Putin on the boosted trade numbers during a customary end of year talk between the two leaders, where he also called for the two countries to enhance strategic coordination and continue to be each other's development opportunity and global partner. The talk, conducted over video link in December, was one of at least 4 sets of conversation, including one face-to-face meeting between Xi and Putin since the start of the war. Xi has yet to speak to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during that time, though the Ukrainian leader has publicly expressed an interest. Meanwhile, the security relationship between China and Russia has raised concern among America's Asian allies. In recent months, China has sent more than 2,000 personnel into Russia for a joint drill, dispatched its strategic warplanes for patrols alongside Russia's over the Sea of Japan and East China Sea, and deployed a number of vessels for week-long live-fire joint naval exercise in water near Japan. On Tuesday, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and visiting NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg voiced concern over Russia's growing military cooperation with China, including joint operation and drills in the Bing City of Japan in a meeting in Tokyo, according to their joint statement. But even as those engagements, as well as its flourishing trade and diplomacy, may have elevated awareness about the China-Russia relationship in the West, they remain a foundation for China's overall foreign policy, in which Russia also plays a key role, bolstering China's influence at the UN, according to Jean-Pierre Caveston, an emeritus professor at Hong Kong Baptist University Department of Government and International Study. The relationship with Russia prevails in terms of China's external interest because it's aimed against the United States and the United States alliance systems both in Europe and in Asia. He said China's main object is to weaken those alliance systems. We are the report, Fossac TV.